Chapter 24. Cleanse. Lionel hadn't moved in weeks. He wasn't even consciously aware of the fact that Aina had left and come back several times already. Without any strong threats around him, and subconsciously putting his trust in her, he went all out. Due to the strong winds and comfort that emitted from his tent, the Frenchmen hadn't dared to approach. By now they were all convinced that he was an envoy of God. Aina entered the tent once more, but this time she frowned deeply, seeing his current state. Lionel's lips were a deep shade of blue, his body quaking with every passing second. The whirlwind of force surging toward him was more than 10 times greater than it had been on the first day. Whether that was due to the increase in his spirit or due to the fact he had a deeper understanding of the technique after actually reading it, it was impossible to tell. Ghastly blue-green veins ran across Lionel's neck and forehead. Beads of sweat rolled down his body, mixing in with the foul odor it was giving off. If Lionel knew that Aina had continuously dealt with his body odor without a complaint for so many weeks, who knew how he'd feel? If one peered into Lionel's brain stem, it would be possible to see a growing seed of concentrated force. There was no simple way to complete this process. Lionel had to carve out his own flesh while simultaneously using force to heal himself. This was why this step was so dangerous. The brain stem was arguably the most important part of the brain. If it was ever damaged, death was basically guaranteed. Yet Lionel had to actively do exactly that to carve out a node for himself. The only way this was possible was due to the special characteristic of U-dimensional cleanse. Not every force technique would carve out nodes in the same places, and most directly avoided such dangerous areas. It was precisely because the creator of this technique was so confident in his methods that he dared pen down this technique. Use your senses to perfectly memorize the structure of cells in your brain. Stemma, reorganiza, stimulate their recreationa, destroy the originala repeatach. It took hundreds of years of research before humans of Earth were able to use stem cells to reproduce brain cells. In fact, it was still in its infant stages even now. Yet, this technique was able to use force to surpass anything Earth was capable of. However, it was still up to Lionel in the end to repeat this process countless times. It was simply impossible for him to do this for every one of the millions of cells in his brain stem. That said, a normal node formed of 4th-grade force would barely be visible to the naked eye and could have its size measured in cubic micrometers. The issue Lionel faced was that his node was not normal. And though a normal node would only take up the space of about 10 cells at most, the true difficulty came in properly restructuring everything, so that your mind could continue to function properly. That alone was already difficult, but Lionel had to replace and reorganize not just 10 celsa, but 100. On any other day, a mere paper cut could slice across far more than 100 human cells with ease. But to Lionel, that seemingly small number was the barrier between him and death. He knew he could have stopped at 10, that he could have stopped at 20, even at 50. These numbers were already far more than a normal person could match. And it should also be considered that U-dimensional cleanse wasn't a normal technique to begin with. Another technique might have their user form a node of 5 cells at most. But Lionel knew that if he stopped, he would be cheating himself. What had he wasted so much time priming himself for if he wasn't going to tap into his full potential? If he stopped now, then he might as well have formed his first node back when his spirit was at 0.12. Blood began to leak from Lionel's nose. It was such a deep crimson that it almost appeared black. The calculations running through Lionel's mind were astronomical. Just how many other neurons did 100 brain stem cells connect to? How many spinal connections? How many smooth muscle connections? How many organs did they control? Rerouting his whole body like this put immense pressure on his mind. He just wanted to sleep, to alleviate that pain racking his body, but he knew he couldn't. Persistenza. His back straightened. He realized now that the reason he fought those 7 A-grade invalids wasn't because of some random excuse. It was because of something his father had ingrained in his body since he was young. Persist. Aina stood at the doorway, her teeth biting down hard on her soft lips. He's forming his first node now? How's that possible? He should at the very least be on his 5th or 6th high. Is his high coordination and reaction purely due to his ability then? What kind of ability is that? Aina obviously didn't have access to the same stats Lionel self-created. But She had a natural ability to read people that came from years of training and experience. From her experience, it was simply impossible to have such high base stats without first forging nodes. She herself was already working on her 7th. In fact, the base strength she displayed wasn't her full strength. Because she rarely used her force, the stats Lionel had of her were actually wrong. After all, he can only measure what he can see, and he had too little knowledge of force before. The only point that stood now, however, was the fact Lionel's ability, whatever it was actually so grade 8. Suddenly, a roar escaped Lionel's lips, a shower of blood bursting from the pores of his body. In the next moment, the sound of something that almost resembled a massive flame being lit swept through. Concentric circles of rippling force winds and dust billowed around him, shooting the tent he sat into the sky. Lionel opened his eyes with a flash, their hazel burning with a deep blue light that flickered and disappeared a moment later. He was a complete mess. His body was coated in blood from head to toe. In fact, his general vicinity looked as though a concentrated rain of blood had fallen, splattering around gruesomely. However, if one looked closely, one could see that this wasn't normal blood. It had an impure, brownish-black quality to it that released a terrible smell. At that moment, despite his looks, Lionel felt more alive than he ever had. Lionel Morales. Strength, 0.8. Speed, 0.75, 0.1. Agility, 0.85, 0.1. Coordination, 1. Stamina, 0.87, 0.5. Reactions, 1. That was it. He had crossed the limits the human body could theoretically endure. His other stats hadn't improved, but this made sense. After all, it was a node for his brain, not his body. They only had minor ticks up. But Lionel knew that if he activated the force in his first node, his stats would increase by another margin. Seems I've missed something important, Hayton, Lionel reprimanded himself. You stink. Ina's soothing voice appeared above Lionel's sitting form. Lionel was speechless. But, looking down at himself and taking a whiff, even he could only cringe. Sweeping out his senses, he quickly found the nearest water source. Come with me, Lionel said. Ina raised an eyebrow. Lionel grinned. It's all right. I'm okay with you taking advantage of me. It was Ina's turn to be speechless. In the end, she turned and blushed, not meeting Lionel's eyes. At that moment, Lionel couldn't hide the confusion in his heart. He had thought that Ina's bashful personality was all just an act, not different from how Yuri pretended to be the kind, considerate friend for so many years. But what was this? Leaving you here doesn't sit well with me. Come on. Lionel dashed away. After seeing that he wasn't scrutinizing her anymore, Ina quickly followed. By the time she caught up, Lionel was already stripping by a riverside. Flustered, she could only find a tree to sit behind in the opposite direction. Ina's militaristic outfit didn't have any defensive abilities. All it had were its convenient pockets that allowed her to store many things like miniature spatial devices. And the real reason she chose it, a self-cleaning function. She liked to stay clean, but she was also practical. Finding a place to bathe in a zone or even on Earth right now was near impossible. So though she missed the feeling of water gliding across her soft skin, she gave it up. Do you think they'll be all right without us? Lionel's voice traveled to Ina's as he alternated between scrubbing himself and his clothes. They'll be fine, Ina said softly. Yuri knows what to do. Plus, only the beginner zone works on the same timeline. The zone we're in currently is 10-1. Not even 3 days have passed to them yet. Oh, I didn't know that, Lionel muttered. Ina always seemed to speak to him as if the things she was saying were obvious. Did she not realize that he had no idea what she was talking about? Lionel frowned. Uncle Montez said that because Earth had so much potential, there were several other worlds looking to get a piece of the piat. His words seemed to imply that they had started doing this even before the metamorphosis began. Could Ina's family be related to this? Did you really only just light your first node? After several moments of silence, Ina's sweet voice traveled to his ears again. You know about nodes? Lionel asked, surprised. Did you think you were the only one? Lionel could almost hear the light smile through Ina's voice. He could barely hold back his desire to see it. Sort of on one you hadn't do. I had to do a lot to get my hands on the method. I didn't think others were already aware. Lionel wasn't lying. He only got dimensional cleansier because he was the first to clear a zone, and as such, he received a Tier 9 black reward. There could only be one of him, right? But it seemed he forgot to consider that a force technique didn't have to be such high grade. And also, from Uncle Montez's words, maybe others had gotten their hands on treasures through other means. Maybe that was why Aina seemed to have more treasures on hand than she should. I did just light my first one, Lionel eventually answered. I chose my brainstem as my first location, so it was pretty dangerous. I should have prepared some more. Aina froze. What did you just say? Lionel raised an eyebrow. That I chose my brain, ah. Are you insane? Oh, huh? How was he supposed to respond to that? Maybe? Maybe. Why didn't you just pick a spot on your legs? You can only choose 9 locations at best, and most can't even form a second. Recklessly choosing your brain now is not only dangerous, but if you reach a bottleneck in your potential, your bodily strength will always be substandard. Lionel could hear Aina almost huffing and puffing. It seemed the Aina who could curse out a grown man 3 times her size had come out. He was too angry to see it that night, but he was sure it was an adorable sight. I knew I should have woken you apart. Aina bit her lip again. You shouldn't do that. You'll scar your lip. Aina was shocked awake from her own rant, finding Lionel standing before her with wet, dripping hair. It was fine if he wanted to come, but did he really have to do it shirtless? You don't understand. The bottlenecks people face get worse and worse with every step. Unless you're lucky enough to be born with a lineage factor that gives you natural force nodes. Reaching past the 3rd node is impossible. You would need force node medicines, but Earth just can't produce those now. Lionel smiled. You don't have to worry about me. It was a smile he had practiced in the front of the mirror so many times, the very smile he prepared just for this one person. Seeing Aina completely disarmed, he felt a swelling of satisfaction in his heart. Whoever that old fart is who wrote a dimensional cleanser really is a liar. No difference between cultivated and natural force nodes, my ass. You could have at least mentioned this in a footnote, you ass. No. After recovering, Aina's expression turned serious once more. It's good that you know that I'm worrying. In that case, be less reckless and choose your right arm for your next node. It will improve your throwing abilities by a large margin. Lionel nodded innocently like an obedient child, but internally he had no intention of listening. After awakening his first node, Lionel gained a greater grasp of just what his ability was. If he had to sum it up in one word, it was calculation. In the simplest terms, his mind was like a supercomputer. The reason why he had almost mistaken internal sight for his ability was precisely because of his mind's ability to make use of that information far better than anyone else would be able to. It was the reason he could tell the difference between a loaded and unloaded gun by its weight. It was the reason he could assign stats just by glancing at a person's body. And it was the reason he was certain that there was a perfect configuration of nodes that would maximize his body's potential. He had accidentally stumbled into the perfect start with his brainstem, and he didn't plan on taking the second until he had gathered enough knowledge to find the next perfect step. That said, he had already eliminated his arms, legs, and most of his chest. He was certain that the perfect second node was along his spine somewhere. He just had to run a few more calculations to find that flawless location. As for Aina's worries, well, what she didn't know wouldn't hurt her. Aina seems to be preparing to form her 7th force node. Her node locations actually have 93% compatibility with her. I didn't expect that. Oh, what are you doing? Aina frowned as she gazed at Lionel. She felt for a moment that she had been stripped bare in front of him, but she couldn't find a logical reason why. Lionel's spirit was just too far above hers. Had he not been standing right in front of her, she might not have even noticed. Lionel snapped out of his thoughts. He had just seen something that explained to him why it was Aina seemed to cultivate without pulling in force energy. She was actually practicing a technique aside from a force technique, one that applied particular pressure on her blood. However, Lionel knew instinctually he couldn't practice this technique. Only those with Aina's blood could talk. Just what's her story exactly, Sorry, just committing your words to memory. Lionel saluted like a soldier. Beef da. Aina laughed beside herself. It was such a dazzling scene that Lionel stood completely frozen in time. I bet she didn't have to practice that in front of a mirror. Just then, the sounds of war horns reached their ears. Sending a glance toward each other, they dashed back to the war camp. Chapter 25. Conscience. As he ran, Lionel squeezed his still wet, flexible armor on. Its black fabric flexed, clinging tightly to his body. Luckily, he hadn't been foolish enough to leave his weapons behind. No matter how uneventful the last month had been, Lionel would never forget that he was in the middle of a subdimensional zone. The idea of time dilation sounded great. Thanks to zones, Lionel would be able to experience more life than his lifespan dictated, and even train faster than he should. But zones were not a joke. If the main quest couldn't be accomplished, they'd be stuck here to their deaths. Only then would the zone open once more to allow another to try. A zone wasn't a place that could be taken casually. If there was anything Lionel had learned in the Mayan temple, it was that. The two, Lionel and Aina, hadn't traveled more than a kilometer from the campsite. It took them less than 2 minutes to return, finding the group of 1,000 men quickly organizing. Lionel got a read on the situation quickly. It seemed that a scout had caught wind of an approaching English army, bearing down on Orleans. From what Lionel knew, Orleans was one of the first, if not the very first battle Joan of Arc had fought in and won. It was an important city on the edge of what remained of French territory, and what was once French territory but now English territory. Back then, or what was considered right now, it was unprecedented and skyrocketed her fame upward. However, with such a critical loss, and to a woman no less, it wasn't a surprise that the English would try and take it back as soon as possible. It was just bad luck that this encampment happened to be in their way. The smart decision was to retreat and send a messenger ahead to warn Joan and Orleans. The encampment had likely already done the latter, but for some reason they weren't doing the first. If we retreat now, the common people are finished. We must hold out for as long as we can. Lionel's gaze flickered. Ultimately, knights were still nobles. Though France had run into a problem of lacking enough land to consecrate these knights properly during this era, this fact still remained. How rare was it for a noble to care about the common people in this time? I've never heard of this General Frank before, likely because his name had been washed out of history, maybe due to this very act here. But his actions are commendable. Lionel looked toward Aina. I'm going to help them. You're a front-line fighter, so you'll be at too much risk if you jump into such a lopsided fight. Just stay next to me. Lionel was well aware that both he and Aina had surpassed the limit of humans, but they weren't gods. They still got tired, they could still get injured, and they were more than susceptible to overwhelming numbers. Aina looked toward Lionel blankly for a moment before shaking her head. If you don't want me to die, then you'll just have to put a bit of extra effort into covering for me. Her voice still carried the same gentleness, but it had an unyielding command to it. Lionel felt that her will was far stronger than his own. Lionel closed his eyes. If they were open, it would be possible to see a deep flicker within them. General Frank, do you have any siege engineers with you? Or any who have experience working with them? Well, yes. We need a few to properly fortify our encampment. Good. Give them to me and a few men to chop down some wood. You build your defenses. Quite frankly, the general was much too scared of Lionel to refuse. When the engineers heard of Lionel's asks, they looked at him weirdly. The request wasn't difficult at all. In fact, it was ridiculously easy. They could easily complete the 3 of them Lionel asked for by the time the Englishmen were in range. After you finish chopping down the trees the engineers need, continue and build at least 50 cheval de frise after we're done. Cheval de frise? Lionel patted his forehead. Had such a thing not been invented yet? Without the proper experience, finishing 50 like he hoped would be impossible. Unla. Simplify the design. Lionel's mind churned. In a flash, he had an idea that could work. Walking to the sparse forest of trees that surrounded a part of the river he had bathed in, he borrowed an axe and cut down a thin tree with a diameter no larger than about 8 inches. He worked swiftly, leading by example. He separated the length of the tree into portions about 1.5 meters long. Then, cut those portions widthwise into fourths. In the end, from a single tree, he managed to get 8 total 1.5 meter length pieces. Brandishing the axe, he began to chip away at both ends of these pieces. Eventually, they ended up looking like double-headed spears, albeit much thicker than a spear should be. A cheval de frise is a device capable of nullifying cavalry. It stops the charging of horses by placing deadly barriers in their path. Even if the cavalrymen are aware of their danger and avoid them, it will slow down their charge and disrupt their formation. If they aren't aware of them, the result will be even more devastating. I want you to do exactly as I did after you've prepared what the engineers need. Vina. Lionel slammed 3 of the double-ended spears he created into the soil at an angle, just about a foot or so apart. Press them into the ground just like this in sets of 3. Work in lines that cover the battle in a systematic way. Between every set of 3, leave about 2 meters of space, and lay out a single line to extend about 100 meters. When you finish laying a line of 100 meters, move back about 5 meters and begin a new line. But don't place them in the same positions as the first line, or else the enemy can just charge straight through the gaps. Make it so that even if an enemy makes it past, they must swerve and slow themselves down continuously. Do you understand? The warriors nodded fervently, jetting off to their work. They were a bit skeptical of how just laying down spikes could stop a cavalry, but much like their general, they were too scared to refute. Against Lionel's expectations, General Frank actually committed 100 men to Lionel's cause. Lionel hadn't thought he'd receive such support, so he had asked for very little. But he had underestimated their religious fanaticism. If they weren't like this, why else would they trust a small village girl like Joan with their lives? By the time Lionel's sharp gaze could see the Englishmen over the horizon, marching under the high sunlight in perfect rectangular formations, the battlefield was already set. It's as perfect as it can be, Lionel thought to himself. The river to our back only has one shallow enough point to cross within tens of miles. They have no choice but to come through here. The encampment itself was already chosen to be on a small hill, to act as a temporary fortress sought, and everything is in my line of sight. Lionel climbed to the top of a set of wooden staircases. This was the device he had asked the siege engineers to build. It was nothing but a simple elevated platform. From afar, it looked like a staircase that led nowhere. It could be considered to be a simplified siege tower. The differences lied in the fact that there were no castle walls to scale here, and it was a great deal shorter than what it would usually be. But, for Lionel's purposes, this height was enough, especially with the help of the elevated position of the encampment. All around the destinationless staircase, barrels of crudely made spears lied. Lionel knew that he could work faster to complete what he had asked of the Frenchman, but he had spent all of this time forming thousands of spears. He hadn't had the luxury of helping them. A small encampment like this one wouldn't carry so many weapons with them. He could only make them on his own. When he reached the top, there was only a single barrel filled with about 100. Unfortunately, this was all he could fit without impeding his throwing motion. The space was quite small, only about 1.5 meters in width and 2 in length, so he had to make do. He picked up a crude wooden spear, weighing it in his hands. A sigh escaped his lips. Only he would be mad enough to try and throw such a poorly weighted weapon. But there hadn't been time to build any stabilizers for them. He could only rely on his ability. The Englishmen stopped in the distance. There was clear disdain on their faces when they noticed the numbers before them. There were 20 of them, yet the enemy wanted to face them with a measly 1,000. The spikes pierced into the ground were incredibly conspicuous, but what did little branches in the ground mean to their heavy cavalry? "Form up!" The roar brought an eerie silence to the Frenchmen. They gripped their weapons and shields tightly to the point their knuckles went white beneath their armor. And that was when it happened. A small woman of beauty beyond words leaped through the skies and landed before them, all with her back facing them. Her demeanor was almost lackadaisical, a massive axe dragging across the ground to her side. "It seems we're in luck, men. That whore who claims to be of God is right before us. Slay her here and take revenge for our fallen brothers. Revenge for our fallen brothers!" The roar was deafening. In this era, women didn't even touch the battlefield, let alone taking the vanguard alone. Coupling that with the poor information circulation ability of this era, and it was no wonder they mistook Ina for Joan. Unfortunately, this misunderstanding gave the enemy a morale boost Lionel hadn't accounted for. "I'm still too inexperienced, Lionel's gaze narrowed. "Charge! For our brothers." However, as punishment for saying such words about Ina. Lionel's grip tightened. But then, it suddenly loosened. Just what am I thinking? Lionel shook his head furiously. Back then, when those three bastards said those words, Lionel saw red. Before he even knew what was happening, they had died. Afterward, he tried to justify it to himself. They had alluded to all the women they had hurt before. They deserved Ita, right? It was fine if he punished them. But that was just an excuse. What was that feeling he had had just now? That feeling that told him he had the right to execute people as he saw fit for little more than their words and ideologue. I'm losing my damn mind. What's wrong with Mia? Lionel grit his teeth. A part of him had already decided. There was simply no place in this world for his soft heart. In a lot of ways, the words of those men that night had enlightened him to that fact. However, he refused to lose himself to the madness of this world. He felt that the end result of killing was just as important as the reason for it was. He wanted to be able to look himself in the mirror one day and justify his actions, to be able to feel that his heart could still remain as light as a feather. The Englishmen weren't bad people. They were fighting for their country. They were fighting for their brothers. Some of them committed horrible deeds. They looted villages, raped women, took mothers from their children and children from their parents. But it remained that this was only some of them. Lionel wasn't a god. He wasn't judge, jury, and executioner, nor could his fragile mind state withstand such a burden. However, what he could do was work within the confines of his own limits. As long as he didn't overreach Aka, as long as he maintained his respect for his opponents, he could slowly climb over this hurdle. Lionel took a deep breath as the horses and men charged, kicking up dust clouds. Today, I'll kill you not for the words you've said, but because you are the general of my enemy. Lionel closed his eyes, feeling every detail of the battlefield perfectly projected into his mind. He lifted his spear above his shoulder, setting his feet. 50 meters, 40, 30, 20. Lionel's eyes flashed open when the general was just a few strides of his horse from the first line of spikes. His timing was perfect. A low grunt escaped his lips, an unimpeded strength gushing through his body and leaving from his fingertip. The spear shot across the skies. The force was so strong that any unbalanced weight remained unable to exert its presence, leaving it flying perfectly straight and through the slit in the helmet of the enemy general. Even as the first blood was reaped, the cavalry smashed into the first line of spikes. The screams of horses having the chests pierced and legs broken rang through the battlefield. English cavalrymen flipped through the air, completely astonished. But before they could have a chance to regain their bearings, their fellow charging warriors bore down on them from behind, turning the front line into a complete mess, not even 50 meters from the Frenchmen's own. Unfortunately for the English, their start only got worse. Because, appearing like a deathly ghost, Aina crossed the 50-meter distance between them in a flash, brandishing her axe toward those very same unorganized Englishmen. Without a leader, they fell into a bloody mess.